Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Shrink Think, our YouTube channel. On behalf of the Association for MPD and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment, Research, and Education. I am Sandra Brown, president of the association, and joined today with my fearless co-host, Chelli Pumphrey.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be back here. We've taken a little break and
Yeah.
for a hot minute, but here we are, ready to continue this work.
Yeah, that's right. We've been on some kind of hiatus for sure. Well, where we left off, we had started looking at the issue of super traits that we've named super traits that help differentiate other survivors from these types of survivors who have certain personality proclivities that are not necessarily related to codependency. So we've heard and seen all over the internet a lot about how all survivors are codependent, and that's been the problem in these relationships. So, Chelli, maybe just take a minute about that assumption about codependency. We touched on that in the other video that we did beginning on talking about super traits, but just kind of as a review.
Yeah, well, I think everybody does seem to use that word codependency to describe or to help them understand why people would get stuck in a toxic or pathological relationship. And to me, there's codependency is just a big umbrella term that explains a lot of root issues there that could lead to having codependent types of behaviors or what looks like a trauma bond as well. And so I think some of this work that we do here is helping you understand what some of the roots of codependency are and kind of moving, we move away from that term so that you know exactly what it is. So we've talked about agreeableness before, and that can definitely look like codependency because you're all about being nice and flexible and forgiving, and you value that relationship and making everything feel okay in that relationship. And then another one that we're covering here today is the super trait of conscientiousness. That is a mouthful. That is also, as we will explain here in a bit, a reason why people might look codependent, and why it's important to understand that it's not just codependency. There is something much deeper and wired into us that can lead to these kinds of behaviors. And we will dive deep into that here today.
Yeah. So we had started with, like you said, that first trait about agreeableness. Yeah, and this is all related to personality science. And we talked a little bit, if people can go back and listen to the earlier videos. We bring up this issue about personality science because it's been sort of a sleeper science, I think, in that we're just sort of getting up to speed in the last decade about why considering personality in someone's history is really important. Because as you said, we always associated behavior with someone's history. And that's what codependency is, history. Yeah, usually some kind of adversity. And with these survivors, there are some that haven't had those ACE events, that their behavior is being generated out of personality proclivities that is not necessarily related to history. And so that first trait of agreeableness is where we dove in looking at all those symptoms, yes, that would have looked like codependency. This trait was also a trait in the study that we did with Purdue that was elevated as well. And so this trait of conscientiousness, we've nicknamed the integrity-oriented life, the integrity-oriented life. And that's one of the big motivations in their personality. It is this issue of living by beliefs and principles and value systems. These are very value-oriented survivors, and I think that's why not only are they surprised, but everybody else around them, that they are normally so driven by principles, how they ever ended up with a completely unprincipled, a person with poor values and poor belief systems. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, about them getting shocked at how did I end up?
Right. Well, I think that's one of the biggest factors. Well, it can be a big factor in creating more trauma for a survivor too, and raising cognitive dissonance, because here you have somebody that, it's hardwired into who they are. It's a personality trait. And it's usually on the opposite end of the spectrum of somebody with a personality disorder, such as narcissism or antisocial or even a psychopath. And here's somebody who, in the world of, everybody might look at them as this conscientious person who seems to be, sometimes it's almost a little type A is a good way to think about it, just a more general term that a lot of people understand. But a lot of values, integrity, very organized and dependable, reliable. And then here they are with somebody that has a lot of opposite traits than that. And I'm sure we'll go into this here in a minute, but one of the things that happens is, as the relationship goes on with this trait of conscientiousness, the survivors start to second guess themselves and develop cognitive dissonance that is around who they are. Like, I'm a person with high values, or I would never allow somebody to abuse me. I don't believe in that. And then all of a sudden, here you are years in, and in your mind, you're allowing somebody to abuse you and go against these values that you hold so strongly. And that's just an example of how this trait can really do the most damage when you start to not understand who you are and how you got into this, because of such a split there in the way that you are versus the way that you actually seem to be acting or behaving right now in this relationship.
Right. And you brought up an important point. So a few videos back, we did a video on cognitive dissonance, and that is one of the traits that we call an atypical trauma trait, that all survivors, it's like the hallmark symptom that somebody's really been in a pathological relationship, is that they come out with cognitive dissonance. I mean, they may or may not have codependency, they may or may not have super traits, but they all have cognitive dissonance from the relationship. And the interesting thing is that in studies on cognitive dissonance, it's been connected to the higher levels a survivor, as they sort of go up the spectrum, the higher their conscientiousness, the more of that trait they have in their personality, the more it's guaranteed they will develop cognitive dissonance. And so that these two, this trait of conscientiousness and CD, are definitely connected. And that wasn't that was a research article on cognitive dissonance. It wasn't even on personality science. So I thought that was interesting that cognitive dissonance research has begun to associate it with this trait of conscientiousness. So what we know is that this group of survivors tend to have, over the bell curve, higher levels of conscientiousness of this trait that we're going to talk about, which means they're at more risk for developing cognitive dissonance anyway and developing it more severely. And so this trait of conscientiousness, interestingly, when you study conscientiousness in personality disorders and narcissists, antisocials, even psychopaths, is connected. Personality disorders tend to test very low in this trait conscientiousness, which is connected to impulsivity. And so this trait of conscientiousness, yeah, is very reflective, if you will, of behavior. So in personality disorders, they don't have enough conscientiousness. So they have poor impulse control, a lot of acting out. That's where all the infidelity and sometimes substance use and all of that goes with. But the survivors on the other end of the spectrum have a high normal amounts of this trait, which means they're very low in impulsiveness. They are not impulsive. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how that bites them in the butt, not having enough impulsiveness.
Right. Well, when you're in a relationship that's abusive and you have no impulsiveness and a lot of integrity, and I like to say kind of stick-to-itiveness, where you want to try, like, you want to try to work on the relationship. They'll do everything and anything to stick to whatever values, or maybe you know you're married or your vows are till death do us part, or through sickness and in health. And so conscientiousness will make this person try to work through all of these things and not make an impulsive decision to just be like, I'm out of here. I mean, it's almost kind of like wearing some blinders that keep you highly focused on the relationship and all the things you need to do to stay in it and to make it better, versus
Right,
this is bad, I'm going to leave. And really what they need is to have that kick in the butt, or that
right,
impulsivity, in a sense, or reactivity when something horrible happens, to say, okay, I'm out of here. But that just
right.
doesn't happen with conscientious people typically.
Yeah, they don't have enough impulsiveness to cut and run. Other
Mm-hmm.
people's line in the sand on their partner's behavior would be very different than a person with, uh, high conscientiousness. I was thinking about back in the day, I had a lot of friends growing up that were Catholic, and they used to call it Catholic guilt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and because that word conscience is in the root word of the root of conscientiousness, um, is that they are much more prone to guilt and feeling bad about that, deep level of commitment that they naturally feel in the relationship. And so with that guilt, it's sort of gorilla glue in holding them in there because they don't have enough impulsiveness where their line in the sand about behavior would be in order to cut and run. Yeah. So let's go through this trait. And as a reminder, we talked about this in the other video, that trait is sort of the big umbrella descriptor. And then each one of these things we're going to talk about are the facets of the trait. This is not a checklist. You don't pick and choose which apply to you. All of these facets make up the trait. These are all considered in the trait of conscientiousness, not a checklist. So, oops, there we go. So the first trait is efficient, and the descriptor of that is that they are confident, slightly perfectionistic, and resourceful. So maybe you can talk about how that looks in the relationship.
Yeah, and this is again kind of a little bit of what I was just saying a few minutes ago, where they want to make this relationship quote unquote perfect. They might be the ones that are like, okay, let's go to couple therapy, or let's try, I heard this YouTube video on how to make your relationship better. Let's do this couple
Right.
therapy workbook, and always trying to bring those kinds of things in to make this work. Or maybe it's not even about improving the relationship. It also could be taking care of everything to make the relationship function. So you might have a pathological partner who is doing nothing all day, or goes to work, comes home, sits on the couch, and here you are as a survivor running the household, taking care of the kids, doing all the things. And this is where it can look kind of like codependency, but you're that kind of person. You are that kind of person if you're at work, you're that kind of person with your friends, and you're going to be that person in the relationship. And you're probably doing a lot of the heavy lifting to keep things from falling apart.
And I know that a lot of survivors, because again, personality is innate, it's hardwired. You come into the world like that. It's how you see the world. You see the world through these traits that are operating in you. You don't even think about it. And so these are really resourceful people. And so it never occurs to them, until they're absolutely exhausted from the relationship. Like you said, all the heavy lifting they're doing because they are naturally resourceful. That they're resourceful in their job. It's what makes them a great employee. They're resourceful with their friends. They're always the one that comes up with 10 ways to get this done, to improve it, do this, go to a 12-step. They will find the resources necessary for their friends at work and in this relationship, and not even realizing, again, they're not doing it because they were wounded in childhood from something. Lots of these survivors didn't have that kind of background. They're doing this because they are naturally resourceful in the relationship and everywhere else. And it isn't until well into the relationship, when they get exhausted or betrayed, or they learn about super traits to say, I've just always been resourceful. Wasn't doing it because I was needy and really trying to cling to this relationship. It's just, that's what I do. I hook people up with what they need. And it's just a natural, outpouring.
Yeah.
The next one is they are organized, which means they are methodical and ordered. Again, this sort of goes along with that resourcefulness and slightly perfectionistic. Um, Also, what's interesting about this trait of conscientiousness, when we look at it on a bell curve, way over, on this end is pathology because they don't have very much resourcefulness. And then the survivors are sort of up at the top of the bell curve. But if you go further on the bell curve, if they were, you know, 3 more steps over the line, you're into OCD.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is yeah. So you can see competent, slightly perfectionistic. That's just
Mm-hmm.
this side of OCD, resourceful, methodical, ordered. Yeah. If they had 3 more steps over to the right, they would be a little bit into the OCD. So when we think about that in their behavior, it makes a whole lot of sense that they're not too far from that, touching the edge of that.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. The next one is dependable, which means they are reliable. They take their obligations and commitments seriously. And that's kind of what we were just talking about, that they don't cut and run. And
Right.
so this trait, when we study the trait of agreeableness, it helped us understand how that trait got them targeted and was
Mm-hmm.
instrumental in getting into the relationship. This trait of conscientiousness helped us to understand why it was so difficult to get out the relationship. We always think, or maybe the public thinks, it's because all survivors are codependent or have dependent personality or needy, clingy, whatever. When in fact, not all of them do, but this understanding, this personality, especially as it has to do with this taking obligations and commitments seriously, is, another view, a different view at why it's difficult for them to disengage from the relationship.
Right. Yeah, I think that's such an important thing to recognize. And this is where it comes into this codependency idea too, of really challenging that, because again, once survivors start to understand if they do have this trait, it looks a lot different than what we think codependency is. You it's just a whole different ball game. And it's also much, if you're going and looking at, you're needy, you don't have boundaries, or whatever these ideas of codependency are, but you're not addressing the fact that this is a personality trait, and this is how you see and do the world, basically how you do your relationships. And if that is not recognized, it's going to keep you spinning your wheels and possibly stuck in these relationships, without understanding how this plays a part.
Yeah. The next trait is achievement striving. They tend to be ambitious, prone to workaholism, efficient. They aim to fulfill outside expectations. And as the pathological partner keeps raising that bar of expectation in the relationship, these are achievement striving people. They hate failure. And when they raise the bar, I mean, at work or in the relationship, these are people that will always work towards that. They do not do well with failure, which is why at the end of the relationship,
Mm-hmm.
they have like extra levels of devastation. They're not used to failing. Yeah, these are very ambitious and usually successful in their jobs or their hobbies or interests. So they tend to set lofty goals for themselves, including sort of that idealized relationship. And they will, expend great effort, often to the detriment of other pursuits. Maybe you can talk about what that ends up looking like in the relationship.
Right. Well, I think a lot of times, even from the outside, somebody looking, watching a survivor in a relationship like this, it might look like this, like, especially as people, like friends or family might start to recognize that this is an unhealthy or toxic relationship. It's hard for people to understand, how do you keep staying with this person? How are you putting up with all of this? And it's like the relationship just becomes all encompassing, and it's where the focus is. And this internal, it's this, there's this sense of an internal drive of, I have to fix this relationship, I have to stay with this relationship, and things can really start to fall off by the wayside. Or you can, survivors, I mean, it's, there's other factors in this too when we think about cognitive dissonance or things that make up, or create trauma bonding. But this is a piece of it where this relationship takes precedence, sometimes even, to the place or to the point of putting your kids in dangerous or unhealthy situations, or letting go of other important things in your life, like career or other kinds of goals. So, this achievement, like as if this is a goal to meet, like to keep this relationship, keep this marriage, and not be a failure with it, can be a huge factor here.
Yeah. And again, conscientiousness is viewed like drive, like an
Right.
internal drive. And so again, in codependency, it has more to do about the historical aspect, which is usually connected to feelings of rejection or abandonment, where in this, they are much more motivated by avoiding failure. And that the staying in these relationships is often related to drive, about they don't do failure well, so they expend that great effort um, and resourcefulness in this. And again, I think this is where we got to get better about understanding personality science, because like in codependency, that would be an overthought. I can't be by myself. I don't want to be without a
Right.
relationship. Where
Right.
in drive, when it's coming out of a personality drive, a lot of times it's not. It's not that kind of thought process. And when survivors really start to get into this personality work and dig into that, that's what they'll often say. I wasn't trying to avoid necessarily abandonment. It's just that's what I do. I mean, that I'm
Mm-hmm.
resourceful. I fix things. I don't fix things to not be abandoned. I just can't. That's drive. Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's important. And we also have to consider that we're not talking about either or when we're talking about these two super traits. These were the trait elevations. That trait of agreeableness, which is relationship investment, again, drive, not abandonment, but the drive of personality, those two work together. So not only do they have high relationship investment and agreeableness, but they also have the trait of conscientiousness that doesn't like to fail. So the relationship invested and success oriented um, and committed to relationships, and that those two traits, overlap and work together, that it's not an either or thing. These two traits are overlapping and impactful to what ends up happening in these relationships. And then the last one is self-disciplined, and we've sort of already talked about that, not being impulsive, being very typically controlled. And I think, in their trauma and after they've developed cognitive dissonance and they come into treatment, that's not at all how they view themselves. I think they get really confused about what a controlled personality they used to be, and then how out of control they feel when they come to treatment. And I think that's, part of the dissonance that they develop about themselves. Yeah, because they don't feel controlled.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And lastly, the facet of deliberate, which means they are usually cautious and careful, and often wonder, I'm usually so careful, how did I end up in this kind of relationship? And also, there again, with persevering and diligent, that's part of the I don't do failure, that I am going to be resourceful and make this relationship work, out of that drive orientation. So that's the trait of conscientiousness. Is there anything you want to add?
I'm going to stop sharing. Are you okay if I stop sharing this?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So we can, okay. Actually, I think I need you to stop. Oh, here we go.
Oh, yeah.
I got it. Okay. So yeah, I think the thing I also just want to reiterate that I think you've said is just how agreeableness and conscientiousness play together. And to me, it's always helpful for people to realize that, to see that how agreeableness really helps you get into the relationship in the beginning, because it's perfect. You're overlooking red flags, you're flexible, you're forgiving. It's so easy to be swayed. And this is, what a pathological person loves, is somebody who's agreeable. And then once you're in and the conscientiousness is there, it is going to make you stick in this relationship for much longer than you will ever need or want to be. And then at the end, it also has this way of kind of destroying how you feel about yourself, because it is so against your nature and your drive, and your integrity to, quote unquote, participate in a relationship like this, which is really not participating at all. It's being a victim or a survivor, we should say.
Right.
Target.
Yeah. And this view, as opposed to the codependency view, we all have a personality. We all have personality traits. For survivors, the survivors who have these trait elevations in agreeableness and conscientiousness, we take our personalities with us. It is, I hear so many survivors say, well, I'll never do that again because I learned from that. There's so much more work that has to be done about these super traits. we have our Living Recovery program, which is a 1 year online trauma and cognitive dissonance reduction program. Then after that year, then we began second step work, which is to work with survivors about their super traits, because we take our personality with us. It is the ongoing risk factor. And as the professional association, we keep our eye out there looking at the kinds of services and programs that are offered and the efficacies of that. And honestly, the only prevention work to prevent future pathological relationships, again, it's not having experienced it that is the deterrent. It is the deep work, the second step work in working with this personality, your personality traits, because you're always going to have them. And pathological people love that. They love you. That's your who they're looking for. And without real deep work and understanding how the super traits, what they sound like in our head, what they sound like when they're coming out our mouth, what they look like in our behavior, then we can't, you can't manage what you don't identify.
Exactly.
And you can't protect what you don't understand deeply about that. And that's the real, prevention work of the next stage in treatment with these survivors. It's not what we read out there by bloggers. Know the 10, red flags and don't do that again. This is, anytime you're working with personality, that's not a quick thing, and it's a deeper level of work, but I want to throw it out there for the therapists watching that that is the next stage of work, that it's not just treat their trauma or reduce their cognitive dissonance, because if we don't help them prevent this, we already know they're a target. They'll keep, uh, pathological people will still make their way to them without that deep work with agreeableness and conscientiousness.
Right. Yeah, I always like to think of it as like, let's say you have a severe physical disability or accident, let's say you lose a limb and you can recover, but you have to learn how to walk with a prosthetic. And you go through occupational and physical therapy and you'll never walk the same. But it's not that we just do some EMDR and make the trauma of losing the limb go away. We do the EMDR and help with the trauma, but we have to learn how to walk a life with these traits and manage it and learn workarounds and boundaries and
Right,
things like that to be able to not fall into these relationships. And I think that
right,
this is, to me, the super traits are so incredibly important and really a missing link, and especially for survivors who go from one pathological relationship into
right,
another and think they've done their work. And I will put myself in that category, that they think they've done all this work and they have no idea that it's their personality traits that are causing much of the problem. And without recognizing that and doing the physical therapy, the occupational therapy, or the super trait therapy to understand how to live a life with these traits, you will put yourself at risk again and again and again.
right. And it's the survivors that came up with what they call that piece of work, and they call it learning to chaperone their personality traits, and which I love that concept, but it's sort of like that observing ego being outside, and watching that themselves interact with other people and watching their super traits do stuff. So a lot of times, in the living recovery program, we ask them not to date, while they're doing the deep work. When they get further along in recovery, we work with them on preparing for that. And that's what we do. We do an observing uh, ego or witness, about when they go out on a date. I want you to sit outside of yourself. We're telling them to go ahead and dissociate a little bit. Be out here and watch what comes out of your mouth. Watch your body language. What are you thinking? Yeah, is that trait of agreeableness already ready to jump into blind trust? To see those parts, of the personality at work. And they always talk about that was so exhausting to be out here and then watch my thinking, watch what's coming out of my mouth, and I could see it, starting, especially in sort of that blind trust and empathy, that kind of stuff. And they're like, oh my God, this really is a real thing. This is a real thing.
Right.
And they always say, oh, it's too much work. I don't have enough energy to date and be out here and like watch. And so there's other ways for them to work on that. They don't have to only do that work. When they're dating, they can do it with the cashier, with family and friends, whatever. The thing is that they become acutely aware, of those personality proclivities and begin to chaperone them and be curious about how they've operated in the past unchaperoned, and what chaperoning would look like, and, and but as an ongoing life experience. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So
So
helpful.
that's that. Yeah, I think it is. I think it's a big shift away from the codependency junk. So I hope that, people have gotten something out of these segments that we've done on agreeableness and conscientiousness to get a different view of this. So, and feel free to contact us if you have questions, theory questions. Our website is survivortreatment.com. Our email is survivortreatment@gmail. And also check out on our website our certificate in narcissistic abuse and survivor treatment, which is a trauma treatment model, is now available on the website. So anything you want to add?
I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we will be back with more, hopefully with not a long hiatus next time.
Yes. All right. Thanks for joining us today.
Bye.
Bye.